It's time to answer some questions from another Mailbag Friday segment next on Locked On Royals.
You are Locked On Royals, your daily Kansas City Royals podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Thank you for tuning in to a Friday edition of Locked On Royals on the Locked On Podcast Network. As always, I'm your host, Jack Johnson. You can follow me on Twitter at JohnnyJ_15. That's at JOHNYJ_15. And be sure to catch all of these podcasts wherever you listen to your podcast. That can be Spotify, Apple Podcast, Amazon Music, Google Podcast, and on YouTube. Just be sure to hit that follow button and subscribe. We're getting closer to 600 subscribers. So we want to get to 1,000 by opening day 2024. A ways to go. But if you've already subscribed, send it to somebody who hasn't. We're going to continue to try to push a lot of those numbers in the coming weeks of the offseason because things are going to start ramping up. And I'm sure more and more people are going to want to get some Royals content as to who they're signing, who they're interested in, maybe who they're trading for down the road. If this is your first ever episode tuning in to Locked On Royals, of course, welcome in. And I'm just a diehard Royals fan, as I'm sure you are tuning in to some off-season content. I work here in Kansas City at Sports Radio 810 WHB. I've got a night show once a week on 810 and a morning show Monday through Friday on ESPN Kansas City. So I stay pretty busy talking all things sports. But when you click on this podcast, whether it be through Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or you're watching the video on YouTube, just know that you are getting 30 straight minutes of Royals baseball, which I'm sure if you've already clicked on this link, if you clicked on this video, that's what you were looking for in the first place. Well, today's episode is brought to you by Jase Medical. You know, I think you always want to be taken care of, never have to worry about the unknown. I know it's going to happen when you have payments to make, car payments, house payments, dealing with a family, but Jase Medical can take care of you with some life-saving antibiotics, and we're going to have more about them coming up in about 10 to 15 minutes or so, because not to waste any more time, we want to get into our Mailbag Friday segment. Some questions that were sent my way. We do this every single Friday. You can reach out to me through Twitter. You can make them public and just respond to the tweet that I put out there. If you don't really want your question to be public, you can always direct message me. And as I've been kind of pushing throughout this week, we're going to be up on Instagram and TikTok by the end of the weekend. So that can be another way that you'll be able to ask me questions. And I'm going to do my best to try to get to every single one that I can. Also on YouTube as well. If you want to just respond in the comments on Thursday, because I usually compile all the questions on Thursday and answer them, of course, in our Friday edition. So you ever want to ask them there, I will try to get to them as best I can and get to every single outlet, because I don't want to leave anybody in the dark or everybody short-ended when they're trying to ask a question about these Kansas City Royals. Let's get right into it. The first question that I got in this Mailbag Friday segment, we got about 5 or 6 to get into today. The first one I got was from Matt. He said, on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being the most, how disappointed will we be when the 24 season starts and the Royals won't have done near as much as we want them to? I think it would be a 10 because that to me would show that everything that J.J. Picollo was saying was just simply fodder. It didn't really matter. He was just saying things to appease the public, and that's what I wanted to see differently from J.J. Picollo. I didn't want him to feed the BS of, well, we want to be more aggressive. We want to be more transactional. We want to go out there and build this bullpen back up in this rotation. And if they don't significantly do that, what reason do I have to believe that you can be the guy? Because as we've discussed before in a podcast episode, was that, some of these teams around baseball are showing it doesn't take you 5 or 6 years to make this team more competitive, to build a winner. It shouldn't take that long. You can do it if you are willing to spend a little bit of money, and your scouts, I know it's easier said than done, but your scouts can find more talent in a manageable payroll. I'm not asking the Royals to spend Texas Ranger money because the Texas Rangers are in a league of their own. Arizona, though, they didn't spend much money, and they lost 110 plus games, I think it was. And then we're in the World Series 2 years later. It can be done, which is why I look at the Royals and go, you have an opportunity here. You don't have a high payroll. You're not tied up in any money. If you don't add a lot of pieces to this team to make them an 80 to 85 win team, I can't believe that you're the guy, because if you don't add, then you're probably bound for another 100 loss season. And that's where I'm going to lose a lot of respect in the front office and ownership if they're willing to go through that again. And also keep in mind, you're not getting any number one draft pick. You're not guaranteed that. The lottery system has shaked up everything. So there's no reason to tank anymore. There's no reason to lose 100+ games. If the Royals get the number one overall pick, the 106 loss season maybe is worth it. But next year, I can't sit through another 100+ loss season. So I'm not going to stand by with that. Question number 2, Ben asked, Bobby Witt Jr. 2024 projections. It's going to be tough to put a number on it. I would say that he is going to be an all-star representative for the Royals. I think they'll send, in a perfect world, I think they'll send 3. I think it'll be Bobby Witt Jr., Vinny Pasquantino, and Cole Reagans. That's a perfect world to me. Maybe with a really good first half, Michael Garcia could enter his name in the conversation, but the Royals send 4 all-stars. They're going to be a pretty damn good team. So I maybe shouldn't shoot for the stars. One of those guys maybe is going to underperform. Bobby Witt Jr., though, if all else, is going to be the lone representative they set. You know, if everything fails, the team's not that good, he's going to be the guy now and not Salvador Perez. So I think an all-star season is absolutely in store. Average-wise, I'm just asking to hit over 270. You get over 270, he does enough, you know, with the power, with the base stealing, with the defense to be a very valuable player. Wouldn't shock me if he's a 6-WAR player next season. It wouldn't shock me if it's a career year for him. I mean, to see what he did in just the second half alone, I can't wait to see what he can do if he starts hot in April. So I think it's a career year. Probably could be a top 5 type of player in baseball. Him and Corbin Carroll seem very comparable to me. Superstar cornerstone pieces for a team. And that's why I think this year, as long as he stays healthy, that's always going to be the factor with anybody, not just injury-prone guys or healthy guys. You stay healthy, I think he's going to be a superstar and really become a spectacle of Kansas City when it's all said and done in 2024. Next question I got was from 150 Guacamole on Twitter. He said, for the most part, our last 2 years of trading have involved prospect hunting. How important is it for the Royals to gain prospects this offseason? I would say it's important. My only rebuttal is there's not really a guy on this team that's going to get you a big-time prospect. I don't even think Salvador Perez would. I think if the Royals traded Salvador Perez, they're going to get major league talent in Miami. The thing that you can look into is that the Royals are busy this offseason, you know, acquire a few guys through free agency, then flip those at the deadline. I think of Aroldis Chapman last year. You can get some pieces there. They had Scott Barlow to trade, got a few pieces. Ryan Yarbrough as well, you know, Jose Cuas, but some of those guys were major league ready, and that just kind of feels what the Royals look for. They don't really go for AA guys or high A guys. It seems like they want players that are knocking on the door of the big league level. So I have no reason to doubt that's going to be the same mentality if they are to trade anybody. But it's a fair question. I would like for them to add prospects, but I don't know if they've got enough talent to really get a big-time prospect, a top 100, which I'm sure everybody is looking for at this point in time. Next question I got on Twitter from Kyle. He said, who do the Royals have to trade? All the rosters are bare bones. If they trade picks, it's trading the future for now. Food for thought. Yeah, I think it's a good point that there's not a lot to trade at the big league level. If they are trading somebody, it's going to be maybe non-tender candidates. Edward Olivares makes a lot of sense to flip, and I know for some people that's going to make them either happy or really sad. The Royals need pitching, and some teams need a corner outfield bat. Maybe they keep him because they can solve their corner outfield bat problems, but they also were linked to Mark Canha, which makes me think Edward Olivares is not their fit. They would have been more willing to go with the 34-year-old, 35-year-old outfielder. So Olivares makes a lot of sense to flip. Kyle Isbell could be traded if they want to go with Drew Waters in center or somebody else out there. They could also try and trade somebody like Salvador Perez and go with Freddie Fermin behind the plate. Just seems a little bit unlikely with his contract because the Royals will have to take on a lot of money and pay him a hell of a lot of money to play somewhere else. It's very limited. Brady Singer probably is going to be thrown around a little bit, but I don't think it's very likely because you would be cashing out at very low value because he's coming off a career worst year. Bullpen-wise, maybe Carlos Hernandez, but you held on to him. You had a bad second half. Again, why trade him at low value? So there's maybe 2 to 3 guys, big league level, but maybe MJ Melendez. I'm not really on the trade MJ train, but it's possible because he's never really linked to those long-term extension contracts. You know, Vinny has been, Michael Garcia has been, Reagans, Singer, Bobby Witt Jr., but not really MJ. So I could see it. I think it's going to be more so guys like Edward Olivares, though. Wouldn't shock me if they flipped maybe even a Freddie Fermin, if they wanted to keep Salvi, I wouldn't be on board with that. But you're exactly right. Bare bones is the perfect way to put it. There's just not a lot to trade right now to get significant value. And the last question I got was from RB Carr on Twitter. He said, do they pivot to Alex Verdugo, who is reportedly available? This was after swinging and missing on Mark Canha. I think I'd be on board with it because the Royals could really shake up their outfield with Alex Verdugo. I've always been a big fan of Verdugo. I thought that he was a young star in LA, went to Boston, and it was unfair to him because he was in the Mookie Betts trade. And when you're in the Mookie Betts trade, you're never going to live up to what Mookie did in Boston. But I do think he'd be a good fit in Kansas City. It reminds me a lot of the Benintendi trade a couple years back, not just because it's Boston, but somebody that I think the Red Sox are, at least shopping at this point in time. And it would not surprise me if the Royals tried to swoop in and offer somebody. Problem is, the Royals don't have a very good farm system, and I think Boston wants a couple of prospects for him. Maybe they could throw in one of their top 5 guys, a Ben Kudrna. You might have to part ways with Frank Mozzicato, but that seems very low possibility right now. I don't think the Royals would be the top suitor, but if you want a center fielder and you want a guy who can hit a little bit, a higher OBP guy than Kyle Isbell, Verdugo would make some sense. I'd be okay with them calling in and seeing what the asking price is because I think the Royals are getting closer. I think their first acquisition will probably be a corner outfield bat since they were already in trade talks with Mark Canha. Could be wrong, just kind of spitballing here, but Verdugo would not be a bad option. All right, that's going to do it for our first segment with our Mailbag Friday. Remember, every single Thursday night, I send out a Twitter question. I'm going to start doing that on Instagram and TikTok. You got questions, just send them my way, and we're going to get to all of them. If we have overflow, we'll make it 2 segments. We're able to kind of stockpile that into 1 segment today because when we come back, I want to go over JJ Picollo's interview on MLB Network and some things that he said. A couple of them were interesting. Some of it was just GM speak, but I do have some takeaways next on Locked On Royals. You are tuned into Locked On Royals on the Locked On Podcast Network. As always, I'm your host, Jack Johnson, and you can follow me on Twitter at JohnnyJ_15. That's at JOHNYJ_15. Before we go any further, let's give a shout out to today's title sponsor in Jase Medical. Whether you're on extended travel, bracing for a major weather event, or limited by yet another supply shortage, you are covered, my friend. Thanks to our partners at Jase Medical, life-saving antibiotics and a long list of daily medications can be ordered in a 1-year supply. Even AED generics for Cialis, Viagra, and Revatio prescriptions. Go online right now at jasemedical.com to receive your 12-month supply on your daily medication. Remember to use promo code LOCKEDON at checkout for a discount as well. If you or someone you love would get some peace of mind by having a year's supply of any daily medication, go to jasemedical.com to see if it's offered for you. Remember to use promo code LOCKEDON for $20 off on your purchase over at Jase Medical. I had the chance to go back and watch the interview of JJ Picollo on MLB Network, the GM meetings down in, I think it was Scottsdale, where they all met. It was cut short, I believe, due to a virus that was circulating around. Might have had to go to Zoom meetings at that point. But it's usually that first spot you can pinpoint on the offseason where rumblings can start happening. Players being able to talk to GMs, to teams. We've already seen, guys like Kevin Kiermaier talk with teams. You've had some of the top pitchers go out there and just be in communication. Agents-wise, Scott Boras is down there. And then you've got, even the possibility right now, like Trevor Bauer's representation was out at the GM meetings trying to talk with teams and see if he can get back in to the big leagues and come over from Japan where he had really shined this past season. But you also get the opportunity to see some of the interviews on MLB Network. And JJ Picollo the other day was on MLB Network just to be asked a couple of questions. And I know that for the most part, I would say the national attention was not really given to the Royals. And why would they? You lost 106 games. We're far past the days of the Royals being a top team in the American League, coming off American League pennants and World Series championships. So no, I don't think many people really cared what JJ Picollo had to say, at least outside of Kansas City. Maybe you're in Kansas City and it didn't really matter to you. But I did find some interesting answers. Some of it was just GM speak, how much they like a player. Oh, they are, we really value them, that we're just so amazed every single day. He was asked about Bobby Witt Jr. and Vinny Pasquantino and Cole Reagans, and that didn't really, catch my ear, if you will, or it didn't really, resonate with me because I know what he's going to say. Oh, really a great player. We want him to be here in Kansas City. Same old, same old. But there were some interesting parts that I thought, I wonder if that can signal anything, if that can mean things are different. The first thing I took away was that he was asked about being more prepared because being a GM in a year when you have to hire a new manager, a new coaching staff, it takes up a lot of time. Whereas some GMs, the season ends and you go, all right, our coaching staff's in place. We know who's under contract. We know what we have to do. Well, John Sherman fired Dayton Moore at the very tail end of the regular season. There might have been 2 weeks left in the season when Dayton Moore was canned. And so here comes JJ Picollo. You don't even say that's a head start. It's really not. I mean, I think everybody knew, let's finish out the year. We're moving on from these coaches, and they did. So that first month, I don't even think Matt Quatraro was hired until December. So at this point in time, last year, the Royals were worrying about who was going to manage this team and manage an eventual train wreck in 2023. And that's not really a bad thing because it was expected it was going to be a train wreck. It kind of had to be a train wreck for how many players you needed to evaluate. But to me, that's where JJ Picollo has more of an upper hand now. You go into the offseason knowing who you have, who you want, you know who your coaching staff is, you know which holes you need to fill. That, I think, is going to be noticed this offseason. Last year, you had to find out if MJ Melendez was an everyday player. Kyle Isbell was an everyday player. Olivares, Michael Massey, eventually Michael Garcia, Bobby Witt Jr., Vinny Pasquantino, Freddie Fermin. The rotation, you need to see if Singer could do it all year. Bubich, Lynch, Brad Keller even. There were so many guys to evaluate, and they knew that, and they knew it was going to be tough. But what he said on MLB Network was, when it was brought up about, being a general manager, what it's like, and he said, nothing really prepares you for it. You can believe what you want to believe. You can think you know how it's going to go, but nobody really prepares you for what it's like, how you have to operate a team. And I would argue that he had a really tough spot. And I'm not trying to be a defender or trying to make excuses, but it's not easy for any general manager in that first year, especially when you lose that many games and you're supposed to evaluate that many players. It's not fun to be the general manager. But another thing he added on to, he said, if I would have done things differently, if I would have gone back and done things differently, I wish we could have held more organizational meetings earlier than when we did. But then he went back to, we were worrying about trying to hire the right coaching staff, going through interviews. I wish we could have had more organizational meetings to address our needs, every single need for this evaluation process earlier on in the offseason. And that just simply couldn't happen because you were going through these coaching hires. You were having to assemble a staff first and then go and give that staff a team and try to figure out who they really want to give a chance to. I mean, you go back and look at that roster. You're going to look back 5-6 years now, the 2023 opening roster, and go, wow. I mean, some of these guys were out of the league 2 years later. I mean, that's just where the state was. And to me, it feels like it was just a lot thrown into a couple of months. And no, they did not make the best offseason signings. And I'm not trying to say losing 106 is okay. It's not. Even in an evaluation year, it's not okay to lose that many games. But I think it ended up being a lot worse than it was thought of because it was just trying to cram a lot into a little time window. And then you're not really going to spend a lot of money. Then there's the stadium talks and stuff like that. They're still going on. There was a lot hanging over the head of a guy that had just taken over that role. I mean, he was in that spot for the first time after being in the organization, I believe, for, over a decade at that point, being the right-hand man to Dayton Moore. Now I think this is kind of his first offseason to prove, okay, you went through your evaluation year. What's next? Who are you targeting? How much money are you going to spend? And that I'm willing to listen on. The last thing he said that was pretty interesting involves Zach Greinke, and that he's 21 strikeouts away from 3,000. I think everybody would love to see Zach Greinke get 3,000. And if it wasn't for the COVID year, he would have gotten it. That, I think, is going to be the most frustrating part of it all, was that he was so close, and it was due to a shortened season. He's not going to get that. And maybe you could say, well, because his last 2 years in Kansas City, he never struck out anybody. Maybe. But when he was asked about Zach Greinke, and it kind of baited into saying, are you going to bring him back just so we can get that milestone? To me, from what I gathered in this interview, it did not seem like JJ Picollo was in on bringing Zach Greinke back. I mean, he definitely praised Zach Greinke of who he was, how cool it was. And even he said it was great to have Zach here at the beginning and the end of his career. Now, whether he meant the end is in there's still a couple years left. He did mention that Zach wants to pitch, stuff like that, but still not made a decision. To me, though, that felt like, hey, if he pitches, he's just not fitting into our rotation this year. And I think that's fine. I know that we kind of fell in love with the role that Zach Greinke had at the tail end of the year, the bulk pitcher. I don't see the Royals giving Zach another chance to go pitch in this rotation. He just wasn't good enough this past year. I think everybody could see that. You can't treat this as, we're making everybody happy. And Zach does deserve to get 3,000 strikeouts. But honestly, I'm okay if it's for somebody else. Maybe some Royals fans wouldn't want to see that. But again, the Royals need to build a rotation that can win them a lot of games. And Zach didn't win many games this past year. And Zach's also at the end of his career. It probably was the last year of his career. But it was interesting to see that JJ Picollo wasn't really entertaining of, well, we'd love to have Zach back. It was more so of, we're happy for Zach. It was great to see him at the tail end of his career, and we wish him the best, basically. That's the way I would describe it. But some interesting comments. Just go to the Royals website or MLB.com and catch that interview. It's about 10 minutes long. Was really interesting. It was with Harold Reynolds on MLB Network. So I really had a good time watching it. Some stuff is pretty bland, but there were some interesting takeaways. So after this podcast, you want to go watch it, just head over to MLB.com or the Royals website, and it's pretty easy to find. All right, the last thing I want to dive into before we head off into the weekend is some rookies that could get on the 40-man roster this offseason. There was an article put out, and there's a couple of Royals players in the minor leagues that surely look to be added to the 40-man here in the coming weeks. I'll tell you who next on Locked On Royals. You are tuned into Locked On Royals on the Locked On Podcast Network. I'm your host, Jack Johnson. Follow me on Twitter at JohnnyJ_15. That's at JOHNYJ_15. And be sure to catch all these podcasting episodes on wherever you get your podcasts. Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, Google Podcasts, and on YouTube. We're almost to 600 subscribers on YouTube. That would be about 300 or so since we took over back in June, I think it was. So still trying to increase those numbers to get to 1,000 by opening day. If you've already subscribed, just send it to somebody who hasn't, because we want to continue to increase those numbers and increase those views over on YouTube. The last thing I wanted to dive into before we head off into the weekend is some 40-man roster talk and some guys that could be added, because the Royals are going to be non-tendering some guys in the coming weeks. I believe the non-tender deadline is next week, if I'm not mistaken. I need to go double check on that. A Rule 5 draft will be at the beginning of December. The winter meetings are going to take place, want to say the 5th through the 9th. And then this is going to be all free agent and trade talk for the rest of the time after that. And a quick reminder that once we get to December 9th, we are going to drop down to 3 episodes a week. But if there is a big-time signing, if there's a big-time trade, we will definitely have emergency episodes, or just have quick takeaways, maybe a shorter episode. Not going to, have something happen and then you have to wait 2 days for me to give you my thoughts. And of course, I'll always have my thoughts on Twitter as well. But it will be pretty consistent 3 episodes a week once we get to December 9th, because we're really in the full off-season element at that point. There's no more meetings. It's just going to be a lot of nothing until February when spring training rolls back around. But once we get back to spring training, this podcast will go back to 5 episodes a week. So for the majority of the year, we are giving you 5 episodes a week. But in those couple months when it's more of the off season and time to get some rest, we'll be down to just 3 episodes a week. But 40-man roster talk, I think, is very important. There are going to be some new guys that are going to be added to that. It does not mean they're going to make their debut in Kansas City this year. You just need to be protected from the Rule 5 draft. And no names here really stood out to me. I think these guys all seem like very likely candidates, not only to be added to the 40-man roster, but to get some time in Kansas City this year. So at least here in this article done by MLB Pipeline, it has 4 guys being added to the Royals 40-man roster, one being Tyler Gentry. I know a lot of the Twitter followers love Tyler Gentry and would love to see him be that corner outfield bat for Kansas City. Number 2 on this list is Will Klein, the flame-throwing relief pitcher who was the lone representative in the Futures game this past season. Devin Mann, who was acquired in the Ryan Yarbrough trade. He's the 27th ranked prospect in the system. He is also to be added or likely to be added to the 40-man roster. And lastly, I think one that is a little bit more intriguing. I don't see him in Kansas City maybe for the next year or two, but Luander Avila, who I thought pitched pretty well in low A and high A quad cities this past year. He's somebody more of a protection element here with getting the 40-man roster, making sure that he does not get picked up in the Rule 5 draft. Because I think, correct me if I'm wrong on YouTube or on Twitter, I think he is eligible for the Rule 5 draft. He could be picked up by another team. And if you are wondering what the Rule 5 draft is, if I'm throwing these words at you and you don't really know what they are, the Rule 5 draft will take place in early December, and you can pick guys that are not protected on the 40-man roster. So the Royals will draft very high because I think the draft lottery will happen a few days before that. So the Royals will pick, or they can pass. You can pick or pass, and you can add somebody to your 40-man roster and your 26-man roster. So some guys they took in the Rule 5 draft, Joakim Soria, very famous there. Brad Keller was another guy they took in the Rule 5 draft. Birch Smith back in 2018 was somebody they took in the Rule 5 draft. But it's been some time since they've really taken somebody with any significance from the Rule 5 draft. But it is a way to add some talent and young talent without having to, I would say, make a trade. You don't really have to make a trade. I think there are times, though, where a team will take somebody in the Rule 5 draft and then trade them to somebody else just because they can get something in return for it. But it is an interesting philosophy and a different tactic to rebuild a team, because it is a 1 in 10, a 1 in 20 type of shot to go and take this guy and he lasts on your team all year long, because that's what has to happen. If you take somebody in the Rule 5 draft, they have to stay on your roster the entire year, and if they don't, you send them back to the team you took them from. But there are some loopholes, I believe. I remember a couple years back, the Blue Jays took Elvis Lusaino from the Royals, who they acquired in the John Jay trade. And I thought one of the young 18, 19-year-old Dominican prospects that was a good project to work on. But they took him, and he debuted at 19 or 20 in Toronto, was not good at all, and they stashed him on the 60-day IL. Or the 15-day, because if you're on the 60-day IL, you're off the 40-man roster. So it was, 15-day, 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 and then at the very end of the year, they just shut him down. And they were able to keep him because of that loophole. I believe that loophole is still in place, just not many teams use it as frequently anymore. But the Royals are going to have that opportunity, but it's also about protecting some of these guys in that Rule 5 draft. I think all those guys would definitely be taken. I mean, Tyler Gentry would be a no-brainer for somebody because you can stash him away as a fourth outfielder on your team. Will Klein, it's usually a lot of pitchers that are taken, a lot of bullpen guys, because bullpen guys are interchangeable. You could take somebody in the Rule 5 draft, they throw really hard, throw them in your bullpen, it doesn't work out. Okay, you're either going to send them down, DFA him, or in the Rule 5 draft case, you send them back to the team. So Will Klein absolutely would be sought after by some teams. Maybe the age would concern them, being a little bit more of a seasoned and aged prospect, but they would know that, hey, this is the type of guy you're looking for. It's perfect that the Royals found somebody like James MacArthur last year, because he would be somebody that would be eligible for the Rule 5 draft. Like, if he was not in the 40-man roster in Philadelphia, that's somebody I think the Royals would be trying to target. And I wouldn't put it past them that if they were looking for somebody like a James MacArthur, I think they could do it. But if they're going to protect some guys in their own system, these feel like the likely options who would be eligible for the Rule 5 draft. And Tyler Gentry, Will Klein, Devin Mann, I really do want to see in Kansas City next year, because he was one of those super high OBP guys in AAA, 26 years old, super utility. Didn't hit that well in AAA Omaha. Maybe it was to change his scenery at the last point of the season. Maybe he thought he was coming up to Kansas City a lot sooner than he ever did, because he never made his debut in Kansas City or the big leagues for that matter. But I think he could be somebody that surprises a lot of people in spring training. I think he can be valuable, kind of a Nick Lofton 2.0. So maybe he would be blocked by somebody like a Nick Lofton. But I do think it is safe to protect somebody on the 40-man roster like that in case injuries happen and you need a super utility guy, and he can certainly provide that. Luander Avila, I think they have high hopes for down the road. They can really turn him into something special here in 2 years or so. Then you're talking about him being in the rotation. So he's somebody I think you want to protect coming up here before the Rule 5 draft. Well, that is going to do it for another edition of Locked On Royals on the Locked On Podcast Network. I've been your host, Jack Johnson, and always be sure to follow me on Twitter at JohnnyJ_15. We are going to be off the next 2 days as it is the weekend, but we'll be back on Monday with hopefully maybe a new player to talk about, a new signing, a new trade. But if not, we still have plenty of more Royals content coming your way. And we're getting your thoughts on Sunday. I'll send out another tweet of what do we want to talk about this week, and we'll get into that all over the next 5 episodes. But until Monday, you take it easy, Kansas City.